Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the On Centerline podcast. I am your host, Sam Terrell, the Northwest Aeronaut on YouTube. Thank you for joining me today. We're going to get right into it today, but first, my obligatory reminder to please hit that subscribe button if you're here on YouTube, or that follow button if you're out there in podcast land. It really helps the channel grow, and I very much appreciate it. All right, today we are talking about VDPs and MAPs, that is, visual descent points and missed approach points. Now, if you're out there listening and you have no idea what I'm referring to, this is for you instrument pilots out there. So if you're not yet in your instrument training, this may be a new concept. But let's start with the definitions of each of these things as is stated here in the Instrument Flying Handbook. Then we'll talk about exactly what each of these points are intended for and some of the confusion around them. So here in the Instrument Flying Handbook, we first find the definition of the missed approach point. It reads, a point prescribed in each instrument approach at which a missed approach procedure shall be executed if the required visual reference has not been established. And then here we can find the definition of the visual descent point, which is a defined point on the final approach course of a non-precision straight-in approach procedure from which normal descent from the MDA to the runway touchdown point may be commenced, provided the runway environment is clearly visible to the pilot. Okay, so let's talk about some of the confusion that tends to occur in regards to the VDP. I'll typically ask my students what the VDP is, and they'll reply that it's the point at which a normal descent to the runway can be made visually, or something to that effect. And so then I'll ask them what they would do if they don't have the runway in sight at the VDP, and they say they'd probably go missed. So then I asked if they are required to go missed in that case, and that's typically when the blank stares start to occur. First, let's review 91-175 Charlie. This is the regulation that governs when you, as the pilot, are permitted to land from an IFR approach. The relevant section reads as follows. Operation below DA/DH or MDA. Except as provided in 91-176 of this chapter, where a DA/DH or MDA is applicable, no pilot may operate an aircraft, except a military aircraft of the United States, below the authorized MDA or continue an approach below the authorized DA/DH unless 1. The aircraft is continuously in a position from which a descent to landing on the intended runway can be made at a normal rate of descent using normal maneuvers. So here we see that descent below the MDA or continued descent from the DA/DH is not authorized without being able to, put simply, make a normal approach to land. This means using normal maneuvering and normal descent rates. But what does the word normal mean, and is the normal the same for all aircraft? As far as I can tell, the FAA doesn't strictly define the word normal in relation to a rate of descent or maneuvering. I may be wrong, and if any of you out there actually have the source of that definition, please leave it down in the comments. But if you look it up on Wikipedia, it states these words. Normal descents take place at a constant airspeed and constant angle of descent. Now, these words closely mirror some other words from a certain FAA definition. This one coming to us from the FAA safety team of what it means to have a stabilized approach. Let's take a look at that. It states, a stabilized approach is one in which the pilot establishes and maintains a constant angle glide path towards a predetermined point on the landing runway. Okay, so we need to essentially have a stabilized approach to the runway in order to continue an approach below MDA/DA. And if the VDP is the point at which that would occur, why isn't the VDP the same as the missed approach point? Well, first of all, let's define exactly what the VDP is. The VDP is the point on a non-precision approach where the MDA intersects with the visual glide slope. Sometimes, as in the case of an ILS localizer approach, this may intersect with the radio glide slope as well. But bottom line is, if you draw a line of what is typically a 3-degree glide slope all the way down to the runway or up from the runway, the VDP is the point at which the minimum descent altitude would intersect that glide slope. Now, technically, the VDP could be further up the slope or further down the slope, depending on how low the MDA actually gets you above the ground. The lower the MDA, the lower the VDP will be along the glide slope. So let's say you're in your Cessna 172 and you don't see the runway until you're past the visual descent point. And by the time you do, you see 3 and maybe soon after 4 white lights on the PAPI. Can you still continue that approach? Well, as with many things, this comes down to what you can do versus what you should do. A Cessna 172 is much more maneuverable and forgiving than a commuter jet or airliner, so coming in a little high on your final approach is not only often doable, but pretty typical in the GA and flight training worlds. Depending on your skill level, the conditions you're in, and a number of other factors, I'm sure you may feel comfortable continuing that approach at a slightly steeper angle, and after all, you probably have more than enough runway to do it safely if you land a little long. At the same time, however, you very well may not be comfortable doing that. Certainly in the 135 and 121 worlds, it would be uncommon at best for a pilot to continue the approach to land after passing the VDP if the runway environment wasn't effectively in sight. You can't just dive and drive an airliner like you can a 172. And even though your aircraft might allow for it, it's always going to be up to you as PIC as to whether you want to make the decision to do that or not. So, as a personal minimum, you would be well within the realm of good decision making to say that if you can't see the appropriate parts of the runway in order to land by the VDP, that you're going to go missed, even if legally you're not required to. One side note here, sometimes there is a VDP published with an approach that has 2 MDA minima published. If we look at the localizer 17 approach at the Aurora Airport, that's Uniform Alpha Oscar, you'll see 2 line of minima published to 2 very different altitudes based on your navigational capabilities. So which line of minima does the VDP apply to? Sometimes there may be a note about the VDP not being authorized for a certain minima, but here that isn't the case. So we have to do a little math to figure out which line of minima the VDP applies to. And we know that for a 3-degree glide slope, we should descend about 1,000 feet every 3 miles. Looking at the 2 lines of minima, we see one takes us down to 1,000 feet, or 800 AGL, and the other down to 580 feet, or 380 AGL. Now, one immediate clue here for you is that the minimums at FIDOV are at 1,000 feet. And then you'll see the slope continues downward toward the VDP. This would already indicate that the VDP is lower than 1,000 feet, leading us to conclude that it's probably published for the lower minimums of 580. But just to be sure, we can look at the distances from the runway, and we see that the VDP is at 0.9 miles from the runway threshold. We can round that up to 1 mile for simplicity's sake and accounting for the actual touchdown zone. And if we know we descend 1,000 feet for every 3 miles on a 3-degree glide slope, at 1 mile, we should only need to descend another 333 feet, give or take. Now, one other thing of note here is that this isn't in fact a 3-degree glide slope. It says here the visual glide slope is published at 3.5 degrees, telling us we should expect to be a little higher than 333 feet at 1 mile, perhaps maybe, 380 feet, which of course corresponds to the published MDA minimums. Certainly being 800 feet above the ground with only 1 mile to go to the runway would not make for a stabilized approach. So we can confidently conclude that the VDP published here is for the FIDOV fixed minimums of 580 and not the higher minimums of 1,000. All right. So That then brings us to the missed approach point. First of all, it's important to note that the missed approach point is one of the only consistent waypoints in which you are required to fly over the point rather than just fly by it. This is denoted on the approach plates by the circle around the missed approach waypoint. So what does that mean for you if you decide to go missed at the VDP and not wait for the missed approach point? As we know, you can make the decision to go missed at any point along an approach. But with that, it's important to remember that there are certain things you can do and certain things you have to wait to do. If you make the decision to go missed before the published missed approach point, you are able to begin a climb at any point you choose. You simply need to fly above the minimum altitude for the published section of the approach you're on and not exceed the highest altitude published in the missed approach procedure. What you cannot do prior to passing the published missed approach point is make any turns. If there are turns involved in that procedure, you must wait to execute those turns until passing the missed approach point or until given further instructions by ATC. All right, guys, so that's it in a nutshell. The difference between the VDP and the missed approach point and how you as the pilot should utilize them. I hope this has been helpful for all of you out there, and if it has, please hit that like button and leave a 5-star rating for the show if you are out there in podcast land. It really means a lot to me. I really appreciate y'all spending time with me today, and we will see you next time on Centerline.